You've been told Roman soldiers needed all their fingers and thumbs for wielding swords and throwing javelins, a simple matter of military practicality. But the actual reason reveals something far more sinister about how Rome turned human bodies into instruments of state control, and why losing even a single fingertip could mean the difference between citizenship and complete legal erasure. Right now, in museum collections across Europe, there are discharge certificates, bronze tablets called diplomata, that contain a clause historians have glossed over for centuries. Detailed verification that the retiring soldier possessed all fingers complete, unmarked by voluntary mutilation. Not just functional hands, complete fingers. And that word voluntary is doing enormous work. Because what it actually means is that Roman military physicians were trained to distinguish between accidental injury and self-inflicted harm, and the penalty for the latter wasn't just discharge. It was the systematic destruction of your legal existence. Let me show you why the Roman state was so obsessed with fingers that it built an entire apparatus of medical examination, legal classification, and punitive enforcement around 10 digits, and why that obsession reveals the darkest mechanisms of imperial population control. Here's what the military manuals actually say. Vegetius, writing in the late 4th century CE but drawing on centuries of earlier military practice, specifies that recruits must be examined for complete hands, with fingers neither bent nor maimed. Galen's medical texts describe the examination protocol in clinical detail. Each finger must be capable of independent flexion, must possess intact nail beds, must show no evidence of deliberate severing or burning. The examining physician wasn't just checking functional capability. He was looking for specific patterns of tissue scarring that indicated intentional injury. Because by the 2nd century CE, finger mutilation had become the primary method of draft evasion across the entire empire. And Rome's response wasn't to question why so many men were desperate to avoid military service. It was to criminalize the act of self-harm and build a surveillance apparatus to detect it. Listen carefully to what the legal codes reveal. Under Diocletian's reforms in 285 CE, any man found to have deliberately mutilated himself to avoid conscription faced one of three fates: immediate enslavement to a military work gang, forcible enrollment in a non-combat support unit where he would serve until death without possibility of discharge, or public burning. Read that again. Public burning. For cutting off your own finger. The law didn't distinguish between severing a fingertip or removing an entire hand. Any voluntary diminishment of bodily integrity carried the same penalty. And the definition of voluntary was determined entirely by military physicians whose careers depended on maintaining recruitment quotas. If you injured your hand in a farming accident right before your conscription notice arrived, you needed witnesses, you needed documentation, you needed a local magistrate willing to testify on your behalf. Without that bureaucratic protection, the injury was presumed deliberate and you were condemned. Now understand the mathematics that made this necessary. The Roman Empire at its height required approximately 400,000 active-duty soldiers to maintain its borders, suppress revolts, and project power across 3 continents. With a 25-year service term and mortality rates from disease, combat, and training accidents, Rome needed to conscript roughly 30,000 new soldiers every single year just to maintain force levels. But by the late 2nd century, voluntary enlistment had collapsed. The glory of military service had been replaced by the reality: brutal discipline, minimal pay, constant disease decades away from home, and survival rates so low that soldiers routinely made funeral arrangements before their first campaign. Men didn't want to serve, and when the state tried to force them, they found ways to resist. The evidence is there in the papyri from Egypt. Tax records from the Fayum region show that between 180 and 220 CE, the number of men reporting hand injuries during conscription season increased by 400%. 400%. Those weren't accidents. Provincial governors sent increasingly frantic letters to Rome reporting that entire villages were producing young men with damaged hands unsuitable for military service. One letter from the governor of Syria survives in fragmentary form, and what remains is damning. He reports that local physicians were being bribed to certify injuries as accidental, that families were pooling resources to pay for medical documentation, that the practice had become so widespread it was threatening the entire recruitment apparatus in his province. Rome's response was systematic and brutal. First, they criminalized the physicians. Any doctor found to have falsely certified a self-inflicted injury as accidental faced execution and seizure of all property. Second, they created a new class of state physicians, military examiners whose only job was to inspect recruits and identify malingerers. These weren't healers, they were investigators. Third, they adjusted the legal definition of military obligation to include men with certain categories of hand injury. creating special support units where disabled conscripts could still serve in logistics, administration, or siege equipment operation. The state's message was clear: there is no escape. Injure yourself and we'll still find a use for your body. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The obsession with fingers wasn't just about preventing draft evasion. It was about maintaining a system of visible marking that separated military from civilian populations. A man who had served his 25 years and received honorable discharge got his diploma, his proof of citizenship, his legal protection, his access to veteran land grants and tax exemptions. But that diploma required verification. And the easiest verification was physical: complete hands, all fingers present, matching the description recorded at enlistment. Your body became your identity document. A missing finger from a battlefield wound was documented, recorded, noted on your discharge papers. A missing finger from self-mutilation meant you had never legally served, which meant you had no legal status, which meant you could be enslaved or killed without legal consequence. This is the part historians rarely mention. The finger requirement created a hereditary marking system. Sons of veterans could claim citizenship through their father's service, but only if the father could produce his discharge diploma and submit to physical verification. Families guarded these bronze tablets like sacred objects, because losing the physical proof of your ancestors' complete hands meant losing your own legal existence. Archaeological excavations of veteran settlements along the Rhine frontier have found discharged diplomata buried with the soldiers, placed in their graves as if they would need to prove their humanity in the afterlife. That's not superstition, that's trauma. That's the internalization of a system so brutal that even death didn't end the fear of being erased. Read the military punishment records carefully. Notice what's missing. In accounts of decimation, the practice of executing every 10th man in a unit that showed cowardice, there's consistent documentation of the method: clubbing by fellow soldiers. But in records of punishment for self-mutilation, the documentation is vague. Men disappeared from the rolls. They were reassigned to labor. The euphemistic language is identical to how Rome described other forms of administrative execution, sending people into categories of work where survival was impossible and documentation was deliberately obscured. Here's the evidence that makes this undeniable. In Trajan's Column, that massive propaganda monument in Rome depicting his Dacian campaigns, there's a scene that's puzzled art historians for decades. It shows Roman soldiers examining the hands of captured enemy warriors. The traditional interpretation has been that they're checking for weapons or looking for signs of military training. But numismatic evidence, coins minted during Trajan's reign, tells a different story. They show Roman physicians inspecting prisoners with specific visual emphasis on hands and fingers. This wasn't about identifying soldiers. It was about identifying who could be conscripted into auxiliary units and who would be enslaved. Complete hands had value, damaged hands were disposable. The practice continued for centuries. Constantine's reforms in the 4th century nominally abolished the harshest penalties for self-mutilation, but they replaced them with something worse: hereditary military obligation. If you mutilated yourself to avoid service, your sons would be required to serve in your place. And if they mutilated themselves, their sons would serve. The debt could never be erased. Your attempt to free yourself enslaved your descendants. The state had learned that the threat of permanent familial punishment was more effective than individual execution. Now trace this forward. When Germanic tribes began overwhelming Roman defenses in the 5th century, they found an empire that couldn't muster defenders. Not because Rome lacked population, the empire still contained tens of millions of people, but because the military system had become so brutal, so inescapable, so associated with bodily violation and permanent marking that men would rather die than serve. The finger examination, the medical surveillance, the threat of legal erasure, all of it had been designed to prevent resistance. Instead, it guaranteed that when the empire truly needed soldiers, it found only resentment and refusal. The Germanic invaders noticed something the Romans had normalized: an empire where men feared their own government more than foreign enemies, where the apparatus of recruitment had become indistinguishable from slavery, where your body wasn't your own but property of the state to be examined, categorized, and deployed. They saw the finger inspections and understood immediately what Rome had become: a civilization so desperate to maintain control that it had turned the human body into a legal document and physical completeness into a political requirement. Here's what the later Byzantine texts reveal when you read them carefully. By the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had abandoned the finger requirement entirely, not out of compassion, but because it had become unenforceable. Too many men had mutilated themselves, too many families had hidden injuries, too many physicians had falsified records. The surveillance apparatus had collapsed under the weight of universal resistance. What replaced it was worse. Permanent military settlements where soldiers' children were born into hereditary service with no possibility of civilian life. The state had given up on voluntary or even forced recruitment and instead created a caste system where military status was genetic and inescapable. The definitive truth is this: Rome required complete fingers not because damaged hands couldn't fight. History is full of warriors who fought effectively with missing digits, but because intact fingers became a marker of submission to state power. The examination was never about military effectiveness. It was about demonstrating that the state had the authority to inspect your body, to judge its adequacy, to determine your legal status based on physical characteristics, and to punish resistance through permanent marking and generational curse. The finger requirement was a biometric control system 2,000 years before we invented the term. Every Roman soldier had to have all his fingers and thumbs because Rome had built a civilization where your body was evidence in an ongoing trial of your loyalty, where physical damage could erase your legal existence, where the act of self-preservation through mutilation was redefined as treason against the state. And when that system finally collapsed, it wasn't because of barbarian invasion. It was because millions of people had decided that any fate, slavery, poverty, death, was preferable to submitting to a government that claimed ownership of their flesh and treated their bodies as state property to be catalogued and controlled. If you've learned anything from this investigation into Rome's biometric surveillance state and why 10 fingers became the measure of citizenship, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting, because we're going to keep uncovering how ancient systems of control reveal themselves through the smallest physical requirements, and why those requirements are never really about practicality. They're always about power. The machinery of state domination operates most efficiently when it convinces people that bodily integrity is a privilege granted by authority rather than an inherent right. So what other practical, historical requirements were actually instruments of control? Drop your suggestions in the comments below.